Okay. Well, so let's flip the tables now. Let's have you take the lead in explaining the second book, which treats similar ground, similar historical territory, just in a very different way, and which is one of the things that makes history fun. So the next book we're talking about is Lutherans in Crisis: The Question of Identity in the American Republic by David A. Gustafson. What could you give us, Ben, on the background of this book?
Well, I'll just tell you what I found doing a little bit of research about the author. David A. Gustafson lived around from 1942 to 2001. He had a PhD from the Graduate School of Union Institute and served for a long time as a parish pastor in the ELCA. And his book is published by a Lutheran publishing house. Fortress Press published this book in 1993, so just 5 years after the rise and fall of American Lutheran pietism. So this book analyzes the favorite topic, the oft-discussed issue of identity and heritage among American Lutherans in mid-19th century America. And that way, it's no different from pretty much any other history book on American Lutheranism. They're a bunch of immigrants. You're going to have to talk about identity and heritage in some way. And that's something we've talked about a lot in this podcast too. Now he points out kind of the obvious statement, but putting it out there, that there are millions of Lutheran immigrants dumped into an American religious scene. There is obviously going to have an impact on the pre-existing Lutheranism in America. But he also takes time to identify what was Lutheranism like before this mass wave of immigration. He discusses this tension between the social Americanization process that all these immigrant groups go through, especially this religious aspect of mainline American Protestant culture and that question of confessional identity. So there's this tension between, he's saying between mainline American Protestantism, which is what, as you become more American, you're probably going to be more like those American Protestants, and that tension of holding on to your ethnic religious identity.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, it's fine if you want to.
So, yeah, I mean, that's a good summary, a kind of overview of what the book's about. If you could, summarize or really, what's the argument that he's making specifically? I'll let you answer that however you think is best.
Yeah, I struggle. Maybe it's him, maybe it's me. I struggled finding a very clear argument, and maybe you can pull it out for me if I didn't get it. Yeah. But he basically says that there is tension between religious identity and Americanization, and he puts them into the two classical groups. The American Lutherans is what he calls them, and they basically said, accommodate the American Protestant establishment. We're just going to fit into that. And the second was the confessional Lutherans, that they maintained that Lutheranism should preserve its liturgical, and this is a quote here, preserve its liturgical and doctrinal distinctiveness to preserve its Lutheran identity. So that's how he phrases it. Keep doctrine and worship style in order to keep the Lutheran identity, as opposed to exchanging it for a Protestant American identity. So basically, the goal is we want to keep this Lutheran identity. That's the goal. So that means we're going to keep liturgy and doctrine, which already right there, I would say is a weakness. I think they were more focused on let's keep the doctrine straight. And that ends up meaning we're going to stay Lutheran. But I don't know if he just phrased that in a clumsy way, or that's just already the issue we have in this book.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. This is we'll get into the differences between the two books later. I would agree that Gustafson does not have as straightforwardly stated of an argument as Keening. If I contrast it with Keening, I'd say that in contrast to him, Gustafson is saying the controversy over in the 1850s, 1860s was all about these questions of doctrinal identity of confessionalism. That's what this was all about, and nothing else. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, he goes into it, and well, now I'm kind of, maybe should I just go through the summary of the book's contents?
Yeah, maybe.
And then
we
my
can
other
tease it out
thoughts
at the end.
My other thoughts come up there. But yeah, he does mention the language and the church government
That's
issues.
true.
And
That's
he says, but he basically says those weren't really a factor in this whole identity crisis thing. And I think that's where very easily that you could find loophole or holes in that line of thinking, saying language and church government was not part of it either. They weren't the major things for sure, but they definitely were. So just the outline here, I might be talking for a while because I wrote down a lot of notes, but he basically, okay, I'll just go right through. So he asserts that although there was no national state church in America, there was a consensus among many Protestant groups about the value of civil religion. Basically, in America, religion stressed the value of good citizenship and harmonious society. That's summarizing, you might say oversimplifying it, but generally speaking, that's what American religion was about, at least in the public sphere. So he outlined American Protestantism. So he's saying, right, there's this process of Americanization that all these immigrant groups go through. So if you're going to become an American, this is what it needs to look like. So American Protestantism, although it's not a church or denomination, falls along these lines, and many historians of just early American Republic are familiar with these themes. So basically, a typical conventional American Protestant was anti-Catholic, individualistic, even, or maybe perhaps especially in regards to biblical interpretation and doctrine. That's something Nathan Hatch brings out especially. The conventional American Protestant had or expected a personal conversion experience, and that experience was necessary for salvation. That's something he mentions. And that's often accomplished through a revival, often done in a large group in a public setting. And finally, the good American Protestant viewed the sacraments of baptism and communion as purely symbolic. So he said they basically had what we would understand as a Zwinglian approach, rather than a Lutheran or even a John Calvin approach to the sacraments. So all of these things would cause tension for any genuine confessional Lutheran. Even surprisingly, that anti-Catholicism, I don't think he gets too much into that. But you might think, well, Lutherans call the Pope the Antichrist. Wouldn't they fit in with all these American Protestants? But those are different views of the papacy too. The American Protestants had that kind of, it's a worldwide power conspiracy. The Pope was going to take over America, the government of America, and Lutherans say, well, no, he's just blocking the means of grace by his dictates, but also that American Lutheran view, or the Lutheran view of the sacraments, seemed kind of too Catholic for people. So kind of on all four of those counts of what it meant to be an American Protestant, the idea of conversion, everything else was in conflict. So Gustafson discusses this broader topic, which is the heart of his book, at least in theory, Americanization. And he summarized several theories, and I didn't really get into that too much, but he does point out, as I said, that issue of language, contrary to what I think the impression is today, at least in general consensus. He says that wasn't a major point of tension. So the fact that you have to change from German to English, he says that wasn't what the crisis was about. That's what he's saying, at least.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with that personally. Yeah. I've kind of changed my mind on that as I've studied American. I mean, it's not a non-issue, but I think it gets made too big of an issue. Maybe we should maybe not go on that rabbit hole, but.
Well,
if you want to.
Well, now that we started, I don't know. I think for me, 19th century language, not really an issue. Early 20th century, suddenly that is the issue.
Yeah.
World War I basically makes it the issue for the German Lutherans, but maybe not so much for the other ones. But
yeah, I think that's right. And it's also a matter of like levels of immigration too. I mean, there are high levels in the antebellum period, but the church, at least in the kind of general synod realm, is not. There's still quite a mix when it comes to language. It's not overwhelmingly German, thanks to like just hundreds of thousands of immigrants swarming in every year. Whereas like in the late 19th century, I mean, yeah, especially in like Midwestern church bodies, you have, I mean, it's just an overwhelmingly immigrant group, where it's kind of a mix in the early Republican antebellum era. But okay, sorry.
But yeah, well, and you look at immigrant letters and they basically say move to Cincinnati or Milwaukee or St. Louis, and you'll never have to learn English. It's just they're German. They're literally German cities. So of course,
in the late 19th century.
Mid to late, for 50 plus years. So anyways, that's right. Both with East Coast, West Coast, General Synod, Confessional Lutherans, they both have German and they both have English language things. So he says it's not an issue, and now that we're analyzing it already, I think we both can agree with that. It's a different, later on though, I do think it is an Americanization symbol. But he also says there's this adoption of the democratic structures, and by that we kind of mean like a church polity thing. Does the government basically run your congregation? Well, in Germany, in many instances, it wasn't always the same, but in many cases, there was a government ministry that ran everything. Wow, that's a change. You come to America, that might be difficult. And he says that wasn't really a point of crisis, at least not between the two main groups, not between the confessionals and the American Lutherans. Basically, Walther and Kurtz would probably agree almost 100% on their church government thing, which ironically, CFW Walther would not agree at all with other confessional Lutherans like the Grabau and the Buffalo Synod. So perhaps within the confessional camp, there were debates, but it wasn't on the battlefield between these two groups.
Yeah.
Okay. And he doesn't really get into that. I'm just adding my own thoughts. So back to the summary here, he says, Americanization, it's a thing, language and church government, not an issue. So he kind of begins his narrative of history, sets it before America is even a country. He uses the familiar case of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, and this is kind of his style. He'll take a lot of case studies, and within a few pages or maybe just a paragraph or two, he'll tell you everything he thinks you need to know about this person or this event, and uses that as his example. And he says with Muhlenberg, these Americans adopted that church government already as kind of that American Protestant. They fit in as far as the government was concerned. But Gustafson's is part of that camp, in contrast to Koenig, who sees Muhlenberg as a confessional Lutheran rather than a pietist activist. He puts him back in that camp. And I don't think he supports it with too much, but he basically says that's the way he was. So Gustafson sees basically a more or less, maybe more of a moderate confessional American Lutheranism that kind of slid into this generalized American Protestant culture. And I might be oversimplifying him, but he seems to oversimplify himself. So I think that's fair. So he next identifies the guy we all know very well by now, S.S. Schmucker. He says this guy he has a whole chapter dedicated to him. He's the preeminent American Lutheran figure, just because he's in charge of the Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, pretty much the dominant Lutheran seminary. There are a few others, but that's the seminary in America. And on top of that, he writes a lot, and he loves to lecture every chance he gets to outside of the classroom. So just as a side note to an audience member, if you think, I should probably know something about Samuel Simon Schmucker if I want to understand American Lutheranism, I would recommend at least this chapter out of this book as kind of a second level primer if the Wikipedia article is not good enough for you. Otherwise, you got the full length Wentz biography, which was a whole nother book we can talk about.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty old.
It is dated, yes.
Yeah, but anyway.
Yeah. All right, so he identifies Schmucker. He goes through some of the other leaders like Benjamin Kurtz, which I thought he could have maybe given a little more prominence to, and a few others. All these guys American born, they see themselves as part of a Protestant American culture, almost more than being doctrinally aligned with a distinct Lutheran confession. They don't really see themselves as distinct, but they see themselves more as similar to the others. I think that's maybe the best way to summarize it.
Yeah.
And maybe putting it in my own words there. They want to bring everything together too. So all these men promoted what Gustafson called, quote, a Lutheranism tailored to the American context. So he's basically saying there's this group that's already Americanized of Lutherans sitting here by the early 1800s. So these guys are big promoters and leaders of the General Synod, founded in 1820 as kind of a synod of synods, and included most, if not all, of those American Lutheran groups. All right, so once Gustafson establishes that American Lutheran camp, he traces what he calls, quote, a counter movement. And he identifies it as primarily originating with German-born immigrants. He does give lip service to the Hinkle family, which are American-born confessional Lutherans, but he basically says the kind of fringe. Let's go to the immigrants. And so Gustafson gets major plus points with me because he lists Wyneken kind of prominently and early on in this process, which I think he did justly. That was a good decision to put him in there. But then he talks a lot about the two Krauths, especially Charles Porterfield Krauth. And he kind of sets up an interesting image of there being a theological battleground in Gettysburg where the Krauths were a decade or so before the Civil War battle. So just there's a theological battle at Gettysburg before there's the Civil War battle there, which is a good image. All right, so he kind of sees as the major climax is the 1855 definite platform controversies. This is a Schmucker coup, you might say, where Schmucker is stripping away a lot of Lutheran doctrines, part of this accommodating the American Protestantism. And Schmucker didn't believe a lot of stuff Lutherans would say are doctrines. So he's basically saying this is what real American Lutherans believe. And they even proposed disciplinary action for those who didn't agree. And if you're familiar with the General Synod, that's kind of shocking because they're supposed to be an advisory body, and now they actually are putting discipline into that. So there's big pushback, and he's outlining the history, and that's kind of what I'm doing here too. But then the Krauths found their seminary in Philadelphia in 1864, and he says the big conclusion of this identity crisis was the General Council in 1867, and that's kind of the end of his story, at least. So that's the outline. He's really just telling the history, and I don't know if he's offering a lot of analyzing what's going on other than telling a narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think his analyzing, he doesn't work it into the narrative quite as much as Keening does.
No.
But in the conclusion of of his book, he certainly, just as Keening tells you what he thinks the lessons are here, Gustafson tells you what he thinks the lessons are here of the struggle in the 1850s and 1860s. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that? Like what Gustafson sees as the lessons of this history that he's just told?
Yeah. Why don't you go through what you've got there while I look up my notes again?
Yeah. I mean, basically it's that, just like this is putting words into his mouth a little bit, but just like in the 1850s, in Lutheranism in the late 20th century when he's writing, there's this tension between trying to adapt Lutheranism to kind of the predominant American religious ethos and staying true to your confessional heritage. And he lists things like, he takes on Keening for a little bit. He takes on the church growth movement. There's a couple others that he kind of movements that are occurring during his own time that he takes on. And he's basically saying, it's, again, to oversimplify, the debates between the American Lutherans and confessionalists are just happening all over again in the 1980s and early 1990s when I'm living. Is that a fair characterization in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying we're going to have to always be on a lookout for this Americanization process. It's not just something that happened in the immigration period. So yeah, keep your eyes open, be worldly focused. As far as a lot of this is concerned. But then he kind of makes his own lines. He says, two issues will not receive detailed attention here. They're proposals of some feminists concerning God, language, and the question of episcopal succession. And he goes into why he personally thinks those things we shouldn't even talk about. But yeah, so he it's definitely dated when he starts talking about the current issues of the church, but those are kind of his examples. So
did you get a chance to look at kind of how this book has been received? I mean, again, this is kind of an impressionistic thing, but I don't know, do you have any thoughts on how it's been received and analyzed since it's been written? I mean, this is a book that's almost 30 years old.
Yeah. Obviously it's out there, and I came across it all on my own, and no one put it in my hands and said, you should read this. But it's cited frequently, but almost, I don't think so much for its arguments as much as, oh, this is kind of like a handy textbook that portrays some of the history. Other than, I looked for some reviews of the art of this book, and I didn't find any, at least in my quick search I did.
Yeah, there was a review I remember coming across a few years ago. I think it was in the Lutheran Quarterly, which kind of takes him to task a little bit on, he's telling this kind of heroes and villains story. I mean, it's very clear whose side Gustafson's on in this, just like in Keening's book, he's very much on the side of Schmucker and the Frankians. Gustafson's very much on the side of Charles Porterfield Krauth and the Confessionalists. And I mean, yeah, you can ding them on that, but everyone, I mean, when historians write, they're not unbiased. They have the people that they prefer more than others. So I don't think that's really a devastating critique. But I'd say that Gustafson's, it's still pointed, for me, it's still kind of seen as kind of like the standard work on, I mean, it even says this on the back cover, the standard work, or the complete account of the American Lutheran controversy, from like the 1850s to the founding of the General Council in 1867. So that's kind of how I see it.
Well, and the review of a name, Karl Broughton, the kind of liberal Lutheran theologian, he basically says, there's a lesson here. Without this, we would be in the dark. And he doesn't really say what he thinks the lesson is, other than to me, it lacked some clarity as far as a lot of that stuff was that he portrayed. He does make some conclusions about just the formation of the ELCA, which was kind of a new topic, and maybe he was a bit prophetic. He's saying that you seem to be focused more on external organizational unity while avoiding controversy, and that's maybe not a good idea. They might bite you later, and they've certainly seen divisions since this book because of those controversies that weren't resolved. So that's its relevance, I guess.
Maybe I shouldn't even say this because I don't know him at all, but I get the impression that he would have been, if he was living today, more in line with like the NALC or something like that, more on the, if you will, the conservative side of the ELCA. But I shouldn't even say that because I don't know.
Yeah.
But okay, so what do you like the book? What strengths do you see in Gustafson's account here after reading it?
Yeah, so I guess maybe I think a lot of those questions are, you have to tell someone like when you started reading this book and maybe why. So I read this book my last year as a seminary student as kind of okay, we're getting like the lectures in class about American Lutheran history, but I want to get a little more in depth. I want something I could put my fingers on more than just my notes or what I see in a PowerPoint presentation. So I ended up liking this book because it kind of gave me a much more concrete, hands-on outline of what I consider to be a pretty important part of Lutheran history in America. So I liked it just because I think it identified some of the major issues and it put it on paper and gave some sources. So yeah, I like it, and I think it's a good kind of a second level primer for someone. It introduces you to major characters, major events, and some major developments. So it's useful in that way.
Any other strengths or I don't know. I won't tip my hand yet. I'll wait till I'll tell you what I like about. Yeah, I like the book for a lot of the same reasons as you. It's kind of a starting point. I mean, when I was thinking about our conversation, I mean, it doesn't say anything too different from what previous treatments of this period have said before. Maybe if I'd make one thing that it does differently, better than say Virgilius Firm's book, which I mentioned when we were talking about Paul Keening's book, kind of this book in the 1920s. That's kind of the first, major study of the American Lutheranism controversy. Gustafson extends what he's covering beyond the definite platform controversy. So I think a lot of people have this impression that, okay, 1855, the definite platform, this is the big controversy. Schmucker and his allies put forward this American recension to the Augsburg Confession, and this is like the climax of the controversy. Well, the General Council doesn't split for another 12 years. I mean, a lot takes place in between then, and Gustafson at least makes an attempt to kind of carry the story after the definite platform. I still think he doesn't. Well, we're getting into the weaknesses. I don't think he doesn't. I don't think he's able to get into all the important developments and maybe just doesn't see them himself. But I appreciate that aspect of it, because my own view is that the definite platform is this convenient landmark in textbooks and overviews of American Lutheran history. But because it's, one of these episodes that everyone that studies this period learns, in say a seminary church history course or reading, they think that that's kind of like that happens and that's kind of the end of the controversy or something like that. Yeah. Well, no, in some ways it's almost the beginning of the controversy.
Yeah. So. Well, and this is kind of where for me, the strengths kind of border on the weakness side of it. I'm going to put it in the positive light. For a book that's only really 175 pages, so kind of a smaller length book, he introduces a lot. So he mentions the Henkel's, the Tennessee Synod, Klaus Harm's 95 Theses, the Prussian Union. He mentions prominently Wyneken's stand at the General Synod Convention, which I've never seen placed in any other history book to date. I might include it in something.
Yeah.
But a little more detail in that. But, that's kind of where hey, and this really helped me with my personal research project. He was the only one who really identified this as a major turning point, not in 1855, but 1845 already. Yeah. And he's just this isn't just one episode, one instance, but there's a lot of different confessional backgrounds, and they all kind of come together. But he doesn't just follow the one narrative, it was, the Saxons in Missouri, they were the only confessional Lutherans on the continent, which I don't think anyone really says that at all, but that's kind of the impression you get sometimes. And he takes to task, as he said, Keening, but he also says, Wentz in his American Lutheran History and E. Clifford Nelson in that the Lutherans in North America book, they just don't do a lot of this stuff justice in their broad overviews. And it sounds more of just a story of one synod or one person, or he's trying to weave it all together. So with that come certain strengths, but at the same time, that comes with some weaknesses too. So are you ready to rip it apart?
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. I want to be gentle always with these things. No, I mean, no, but what do you see as maybe some weaknesses to the book?
So with the strengths, as he's including a lot, he tacks a lot of different bits of information together. Maybe the transitions. I mean, you could put a heading in there, and that's a transition.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just a minor editorial thing for me, but it's like, okay, not really transitioning or connecting thoughts so much. You're just throwing information at us, which my brain can handle that. A lot of, anyone who's reading can draw their own connections, but he doesn't really tell you all the time. And basically, but when he adds a lot of information here from different places. And whenever you do this with a history project, it probably means, unless you're doing a lot of work, there isn't a lot of primary research, but a lot of reliance on secondary sources. So if a secondary source didn't get something right, well, you're going to copy their mistakes. I did catch some factual errors in here in a few places. Yeah. It also means that secondary source doesn't give you the answer you wanted it to give you. There's a temptation to kind of fudge an answer or perhaps leave a major question unanswered. So I think he's missing parts just because his sources didn't mention them. So he wasn't going to, he's not getting a very broad perspective. He's just cherry picking certain things from these secondary sources. He does use primary sources, but somewhat sparingly in comparison to some other projects.
He'll take a work by Schmucker. I mean, he cites his elements of popular theology, for example, but then it's like he spends like 3 pages on that single source, instead of, you know what I mean? Or for example, or he'll do things like he'll quote from Charles Porterfield Krauth, but instead of quoting the article directly, he quotes from the summary from the first biography published of Charles Porterfield Krauth, which is kind of a shortened article. I mean, on the flip side, what I respect is that he's drawing from, this is a narrative of this controversy between the American Lutherans and the, whatever we're calling the other side, confessional Lutherans, old Lutherans, whatever, that goes into the sources on both sides and doesn't try and, digs into the sources of not just the Schmucker and his allies, but also the, Krauth and his allies. So I respect that kind of balance, if you will.
Yeah, it is balanced, and it's not like he doesn't say anything new. He certainly does. And my little Wyneken episode is that one example of that, where you don't see that drawn out so clearly in other histories. He is adding information to our general historical knowledge that is relevant. So.
Yeah. So any other weaknesses that you see?
I think I summarized those already. Do you want to? You are sitting on the edge of your seat, so please tell me what you think these weaknesses are.
Okay. If I'd have my biggest critique would be the way he deploys the concept of Americanization. There's this idea, I mean, if you're defining Americanization as, if you will, an outsider group trying to adapt and change itself to better fit in with the, if you will, dominant group. In the case of religion, Lutherans trying to fit in with what he's referring to is kind of the evangelical, what's sometimes called benevolent empire of antebellum America. So evangelicalism isn't the state religion of the United States, but it's the predominant religious ethos. Yeah. Okay, but for me, there's many ways to become American. Okay, I mean, and maybe you've read the book by Stephen Nolt, Foreigners in Their Own Land.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's talking about Pennsylvania Germans in the early republic.
Yeah.
Sure, they're outsiders, but they also think of themselves as totally American.
Well, let's put this in terms that maybe people really have heard before. He's definitely part of the I think he even used the phrase melting pot in there. So this idea of you become to America and you all mix together and you basically all look alike. Whereas I think it's still the current one. I've been out of school for a while, but the salad bowl theory is kind of that Nolt one, right? There's a lot of different things all mixed together. You don't have to look the same. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. for sure. I mean, and like for Gustafson, Lutheranism succeeds when it resists the religious melting pot, or the whatever the metaphor you want to use. Look, and there's another really important book published actually around the same time as this, a book called, what's the name of it? Lawrence Moore is the author. It's something like Religious Outsiders and the Making of America. Don't quote me on that title. But he makes the point like on how all these different outsider groups, he looks at the Mormons, for example, it's quintessentially American to kind of make this outsider religious group, you know?
Yeah.
And so in many ways, I mean, my argument is like, and actually, if you look at their writings at the time, these confessional Lutherans or the Lutherans associated with the Missouri Synod are making just as much of a claim to be truly American as the so-called American Lutherans. You know, it's American in a different sense. You know what I mean? So. And that relates to the other. I take issue with this notion that Gustafson puts forward, that it's primarily immigrant Lutherans who are driving this confessional renaissance. I mean, he starts by he says that, and then his first people he turns to is the Henkels. He's like, well, I guess the Henkels, who are born in the United States, but I mean, Charles Porterfield Krauth, Charles Philip Krauth, Joseph Seiss, William Pasiphae, I can name person after person, are American born, sometimes of the third or fourth generation, that are coming to these ideas. They don't see them as an importation from Europe. They're coming to these ideas on their own. And I mean, look, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Even you can make the case that someone like Wyneken, your boy, I mean, he forms his confessional identity after he comes, in many ways, to the United States.
Correct. Yeah, and that was part of the big research issue. Now that you opened this can of worms, was it used to that the traditional narrative with Wyneken was, well, he was one of those mamby-pamby awakened guys who wasn't really all that Lutheran until he went to Germany, and then Wilhelm Leah sorted him out. When it's very clear he was pretty. Yeah, 9/10 of the way onto confessionalism by the time he went back to Germany for that visit. So what's the catalyst? I think it's different on an individual level. So it's really hard to generalize what's going on in American Lutheranism, because it's both, right? It happens on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah, but you're right.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. There is a confessional movement in Germany happening at this time as well. Don't get me wrong. But I'll just give you another random example. I remember reading for my dissertation some of the letters. I think it was of Eric Norelius, one of these important Swedish Lutherans in the founding of the Augustana Synod. And he has this line in there. I mean, he comes over as kind of more aligned, if you will, with the American Lutheran kind of revivalist view. And there's a line in one of his letters I shouldn't quote it because I don't have it here, but something along the lines of, the American situation has forced me back to the confessions. You know what I mean? So it's like you encounter this kind of religious, this, if you will, the Wild West of Protestantism, and it kind of forces some people to go back towards that confessional identity. So the point, I guess, what I take issue with Gustafson and even going back all the way to Virgilius Firm is this notion that it's this contest between, quote, American Lutheran and a European Lutheran. It's a contest between two different interpretations of what Lutheranism should be in the United States. There's my overarching criticism.
The question is, did the crisis of identity and Americanization cause that confessionalism, or was the confessionalism bumping heads with Americanization the crisis, right? Which the chicken or the egg kind of argument. And it's it's the both answer, in a lot of cases. So I think the venial sin here is the oversimplification of things, but you got to have a thesis, got to have an argument, got to have a conclusion, and he has one. So
So just to kind of wrap up Gustafson, you still think it's a book worth reading?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't think there are any glaring issues. And I think we're going to do the comparison here soon, which is helpful. The rise and fall of American Lutheran pietism, I think it has that glaring issue of you're really missing something here by saying they're all like this or they're all like that. I don't think the argument is less clear. I also think the faults are less grievous with Americans in crisis. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, although, yes and no. I mean, it depends what you're trying to read for. You read through Gustafson's book, you'd have no idea that there's like a civil war going on, or, or you almost, I mean, he introduces the religious context of antebellum America pretty well. I mean, it's dated because it was written 30 years ago. The historiography of American religion in the early United States has advanced so much, so you can't really fault him for that. But it's what he's not attentive to really is how does this fit into the political and social and cultural context of what's going, and you can't do everything in a book, don't get me wrong, and that's not what he's trying to do. So this, and again, I'm kind of tipping my hand here to what I'm working on. I'm trying to integrate both things together in my work. Is how do the political and cultural context influence the theological context and vice versa, right? Because I think you can't disentangle the two, because that's not how people live. They don't just silo off into one world and silo off into another world.
Well, let's just use an example, right? Try to tell the life of a Christian these past 2 years without mentioning theology, or religion, but also without mentioning COVID too. Right.
Oh, exactly.
That's life, right? Both of those things are. How did your faith get you through this pandemic? That would be a good micro history for someone, right? And he doesn't really get into the Second Great Awakening so much either, which is just huge. I mean, he does, but he also doesn't. So
I mean, I think that's the chief. If we're getting into the differences and commonalities between the book, I'd say the differences is Keening is very attentive to the political and cultural context, but maybe almost minimizes the real theological differences at times, whereas it's almost the opposite case for Gustafson. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. So if you read them both, you'll be just confused, but you'll have a fuller picture.
and they have different heroes and villains. That's the
opposites, even.
Almost opposite heroes and villains.
So they're good to read, just so you can make those connections and those conclusions for yourself.
Yeah. Do you see any commonalities between them? They're both talking about the same period of history.
Yeah, they're talking about the same period, which is maybe the most obvious one. I don't know. I think, and another broad kind of answer is they attempt to answer some interesting, provocative, and relevant questions in American Lutheran historiography. And basically, if you want to understand the way things are today, where the major fault lines are in American Lutheranism, you got to know about the topics that they discuss and they analyze, right? You're not going to understand where we are today without having a handle on these issues that they talk about. So that's where they have a commonality.
I do have one.
Go ahead.
I do have one commonality, and I think it's another kind of fits into a critique of both books. They both very sparsely treat the Lutheran groups outside of the General Synod.
Yeah, I was going to say they don't mention Wells very much, so that's a weakness,
well,
right?
I mean, I mean, the Wisconsin Synod is so tiny still, even by, but But I mean, I think there's this divide in American Lutheran historiography. It's like, we're treating and it's sometimes divided this way, the Eastern Lutherans now and the Midwestern Lutherans now. if you study the period, you realize that they're not operating in separate worlds. They're speaking to one another all the time. I mean, this comes out in the formation of the General Council, which is the kind of culminating moment in Gustafson's book. I mean, who does the organizers of the General Council invite? They invite the Missouri Synod. They're trying to bridge this, kind of bring together confessional Lutherans in both the, if you will, the Eastern states and the Midwestern states. But I mean, you even see this with the figure of Wyneken, who you brought up. I mean, he's operating in kind of both worlds.
Yeah.
So I think one of the goals of American Lutheran historiography should be to not treat these Eastern Lutheranism and Midwestern Lutheranism as these totally siloed camps from one another, but try to integrate their stories into together. So
yeah, well, that's the historian's issue or challenge, though, because then suddenly, well, wait a minute, I should probably be aware of both groups or all three groups, right? That means you just suddenly have to do 3 times as much research.
Well, that's right.
And that's why I kind of give him a pass. Like I said, for a book that's only 175 pages long, you could treat that on a different level from Koenig, who's a little bit longer. Not the page numbers, everything, but he does treat a little more. Well, 250, barely longer.
Yeah.
But,
no, I think that's right. Yeah, you can't do everything in a book. And maybe what you said is exactly right. Maybe the best way, maybe we're not crazy with having both of these books, analyzing them at the same time. Maybe the best way to read these books is almost in tandem.
Yeah.
Who knows? I don't know. Any final thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I guess turning to our audience, I almost forget we're doing this for hundreds of other of people right now, because it is kind of a one-on-one. Just sorry. So we have millions of subscribers by now. You should jump on the bandwagon. Anyway, so this maybe sounds like a conversation between two guys just discussing a book. Hopefully you found it interesting as an audience member. If you have any feedback on this kind of episode, would you like more of this, less of it? This is a little less formal than our other discussions, so please give us some feedback if you like these history of history book talks. And if you have any other books you would like us to discuss, you could send us a recommendation. So, all right, thank you, Tim, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
We'll have more history in the future.